Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris. Now, let me just say, normally I try to keep spoilers out of my reviews. However, I'm about to give y'all the whole rundown on this book, so there will be spoilers. Just be aware. Now, this is about when being Black in the workplace goes wrong. Our main character, our protagonist, if you will, Nella, swallows covert racism in her editorial position as the only Black woman in the company until Hazel arrives, another Black woman. This book ultimately invokes the best friend to enemy trope, as it slowly reveals that there is a larger conspiracy that is up against Nella and Black women as a whole. The conspiracy is that somebody is producing a substance that makes Black women more agreeable and susceptible to manipulation. This social lubricant is released in the form of hair grease. How despicable, hair grease of all things. Now, the plot twist, however, is that there is a considerable amount of Black women that are on the side of the conspiracy, which is wild. Within this present timeline, there is a separate timeline that is kind of being told in tandem. Now, our main character in the past timeline, we're introduced to her as she's running away from something. She has seemingly pissed off a lot of people, and she's running either out of cowardice or desperation. We really don't know at first. What we ultimately find out, though, is that she's running because she just discovered the truth. And so she's kind of retreating in order to set up a larger avenue of, let's just say, resistance, if you will. Now, the background of this, so the two timelines, the first present day timeline that is the majority of the book runs from July 2018 to January 2019. So very short, and it's chronological throughout the book. The past timeline, so we're introduced to it, and it kind of starts like November 1983, but we get told the events kind of reverse chronological. So we're introduced to that main character of the past running, but we uncover the events that led up to that as we go through the book. So we get the truth of the past timeline through the present. Now let's talk about this title, The Other Black Girl. So what does that mean? So that's actually a phrase that is used to describe some of our characters. So let's talk about what the other means. So this is really just an enemy disguised as a supposed ally. We're going to touch on alliances in just a moment and just how Black women form alliances with each other, but just knowing that Black women, generally speaking, generally have an unspoken alliance based on our shared experiences in the world. So it's shocking when we see another Black woman that doesn't really align herself with that value. So for example, an Unspoken Alliance, I saw on Instagram a few months ago, that there was a Black woman walking down the street in New York City, I believe, and one of her braids was like coming undone. And so another Black woman actually stopped and like braided her hair up for her, and they went on their way. So that's an example of how, that person is a stranger, but I'm not going to let her walk around with her hair looking crazy. You know what I mean? So that's an example of an unspoken alliance. However, what we have learned throughout this podcast, throughout various fictional characters and various famous figures, is that alliance does not always equal friendship. And friendship certainly does not equal alliance. It should, but that's not how things work in the real world. Now, the other Black girls in this book, they call them OBGs. There's two of them that I want to highlight for you. There are far more in the book, but the two that are most important are Hazel, which is the primary antagonist in the present day, and Diana. Diana is, I guess, the past antagonist, And she is the head OBG. Without her betrayal to Black women everywhere, but most importantly to her friend, this operation wouldn't be as big. So really, she's the grimy one. Out of everyone, she's real grimy because she started this. Well, she didn't start it particularly alone, but without her, it wouldn't have been possible to capture as many other Black women. Now, the victims, there are far more than this again, but the ones that are most important for this review's sake is Nella, which is again our main protagonist. And through her, we're able to see the advancement of this conspiracy fully and how it's used from start to finish, like what that process looks like of converting these other Black girls, these OBGs. So we get to see that full thing through Nella's eyes. And that's essentially like the whole book. Kendra Ray Phillips is a martyr for the cause. So she can almost be arguably looked at as like one of the first victims of this. And that is who we met in the past timeline. That's whose perspective we're reading through is Kendra Ray Phillips. So she is the one that resisted, and she is the one that, if you recognize the craziness in what they're doing, what the OBGs are doing, Kendra is who you're going to look up to. And lastly, I pulled this one out for a particular reason. So Jesse Watson is in the book a Black activist that is known for speaking out and known for Black empowerment views and involved in all sorts of causes to advance Black people and speaking out about things that affect Black people. And what we find is that he is eventually turned towards like the end of the book. Yeah, actually the very end of the book. And so he was smoothed out. So that's what the product is called, smoothed out. So this person represents the ultimate Black empowerment, the ultimate change maker, and they were able to get to him. And so this is a comment on how big this conspiracy has grown, because obviously it started with Black women, but if they're now targeting Black men, and not just any Black men, one of the ones that is so outspoken, then this is where we're getting very dangerous with this, because again, these products are made to make Black people susceptible to manipulation, to make them more malleable. So it was just really sad to see that they had gotten to him too, because we weren't very sure at first, but then you figure it out. And I picked this person out because Jesse Watson kind of reminds me of a mixture between like a Dr. Umar, a Tamika Mallory, various other Black activists that lead our movements in the present day, in the real world. And it's scary to see like what happens if, unknowns to us, they were to come into contact with something like this and be controlled by someone other than us. Whoever's doing the controlling, they have access to a lot of Black minds, a lot of Black souls, a lot of Black bodies. So that was a really heartbreaking victim to see throughout all of this. And you didn't really expect it because this book is about Black women. And up until this point, we're only really talking about Black women and how they were targeted in this conspiracy. And the last character group I want to talk about is the enemy. So I want you to be very aware of the fact that I did not put the OBGs as the enemy, because we're kind of led to look at them as the enemy, and they most certainly are, for what they're doing to people, especially those against their own will. That's not right. Clearly, morally, that's not right. But I wouldn't classify them necessarily as the enemy. And I'm going to talk about why during my review portion, like my opinion portion. The only real enemy here is Richard. Richard is Nella's boss. And Richard is a donkey, for sure. He is the one that used Diana to distribute this mess. So remember how I said that Diana was kind of like, it couldn't have been as big without Diana, because she is a Black woman. And again, because Black women have that unspoken alliance, we're going to trust a Black woman more than we would trust a Richard. So if Richard was trying to get people to take this stuff, people would be like, no. But because he used Diana, and then Diana used it on who else, and then they used it, it just multiplies, and it's just really terrible. And it's interesting because Richard is the boss, and bosses have the power to make an office, make a team, make them not do things, but like change the culture or change certain things, react to diversity, stuff like that. The boss does have the power. So he's the only one really not affected by these microaggressions, but he's benefiting from this conspiracy because what he gets in return is a Black employee that goes with the flow. So he doesn't have to ask or answer to these questions that may be difficult for him to answer, such as like, when are we going to hire more Black people? Or when are we going to, in this case, this is a publishing company, when are we going to produce more pieces from Black authors? So he doesn't really want to deal with that. He's kind of like just really inconvenienced by all of this. So he creates this thing that changes other Black women, and he gets to benefit off of it. But he's the only one involved in this that doesn't really, he never had to experience those hardships. So it's like, he's really the enemy here. And I have him classified as a lawful evil because he's definitely evil, but he went about this, he constructed this conspiracy in such a way that it's like an organization. And they talk about it, the OBGs talk about it like, literally like it's a company of its own, you know, and they're bringing in all these troublemakers, quote unquote, and they're producing these really docile Black women, and they're kind of sending them out to other companies to, I don't know, take over the world. I don't know, but the way that they did it was very methodical. And so I wouldn't classify him as chaotic, but he's definitely evil, and the only true enemy in this book. You have an argument against some of these other characters, but this is the one person that is doing wrong intentionally. Now, there are a couple of tropes here. The first one is BFF to enemy. So throughout like books, some of them, I haven't read a lot of BFF to enemies, but that's kind of like a trope where it's like you have these two people that are really close that maybe grew up with each other, and by the end of the book, one is the clear protagonist, one is the clear antagonist. There's actually a couple of things I just thought about. I think that movie with Haley Steinfeld, what is it called? The Age of 17, where her and her best friend kind of go through something, and at one point her best friend is kind of positioned as the antagonist. But also that movie on Netflix where I think it's like the School of Good and Evil, where again it's like these two girls that grew up together eventually get pulled to two different sides, and they become, you know, good and evil, bad and good, whatever. So with Nella and Hazel, they're first attracted to each other, or I should say Nella is attracted to Hazel because she has the same skin color. So again, she's thinking, all right, I have someone on my side. But then they kind of get into this weird space where Nella is happy to have another Black woman in the office, but they're still competing kind of for that editorial position or whatever. So now it becomes a competition to be like the best Black woman in the office, or maybe the blackest Black woman. So whether that's like doing my hair a certain way, coming in with a fro or something, or, you know, just doing the most work. And then it kind of ends with this final battle of their relationship where we realize there really can only be one of them, and they're not both going to stay here at the office for long. Spoiler alert, of course, Nella lost because for the majority of this book, she didn't realize what she was up against, and she didn't realize that Hazel was not even her friend, but just that she was not on her side at all. The second trope here is this constant validation that a character feels externally versus internally. So this is something that, you know, with any good narrative, with any good book, any good movie, you have a character that has external forces, but internally that's causing a conflict as well. So we're kind of fighting two different battles with our character, and that's what makes, you know, these things fun to watch or interesting to watch, or what really holds us. So what we find here is that Nella is tasked with compromising herself in order for success to come, because that's really what the pull of this conspiracy is for a lot of people. Some of these OBGs willingly came into the circle because they didn't want to really deal with the racism or the sexism that they were faced with, and they wanted to numb their feelings to it, I should say, because this conspiracy, this hair grease, is not fixing the problem, it's fixing the response. So they didn't have to deal with their feelings in regard to that, and they were able to kind of become more docile and advance in their careers, further advance. So it's this idea that if you hold on to your Blackness too much, it'll cost you opportunities professionally. There's a very good argument for that statement. And it's about how much, or you know what, not how much, what you quantify as success. So if that success is sticking to your values, your core values, then good. But sometimes sticking to your core values is going to go against what other people want you to do, which will kind of cut off your opportunities. And this transcends racism. This is something that everyone deals with at some point. You have to kind of be willing to, or know what hill you're willing to die on. Or if for you, success externally, whether that's getting a better position, becoming a CEO, getting money, that's going to require you to compromise some things, whether it's your morals or your values or your time. There's CEOs all over the world that you know, their family may be important to them, but your family can't be more important than your company, because being a CEO, you don't get to clock out at 5:00. You know, it's always going to be there. So just looking at that, the external conflict versus the internal turmoil in the terms of racism and sexism with this book, that's really what we find our characters struggling with. There are a few themes. So first of all, let me just say racism is obviously an overarching theme here, and it's the reason we have the conspiracy. But I didn't want to point that out. Like, I didn't want to talk about it because it's fairly obvious. But what we can talk about is the things around that and derived from the racism. So the idea of Blackness and what makes someone Black. So this is a constant, how should I say, identifier for other Black people when they're judging other Black people and kind of assessing this unspoken alliance. So the idea that, like, how do they do their hair? Do they perm their hair or do they wear their hair natural? That's a factor in what someone may determine your Blackness on. Or like their cultural currency. How up to date are you on like certain events? Or do you listen to certain artists, certain musicians? That's your cultural currency. But then it can be kind of like seemingly insignificant things, like, do you know how to tie those scarves and like those nice fancy designs so that they look super cute? Like, do you know how to do these things that most Black people know how to do? And this is, of course, some of the things that Nella would use to judge Hazel off of, Jesse Watson. She's always assessing that. And that's kind of something like innate. And it's something also that the Black community does a lot. If you don't do this, you're not Black. Or if you don't know how to do this, you're not Black, you know, whatever. But first of all, Blackness is very complex and complicated because there's no one way to be a Black person. But with that being said, like, for example, Stacey Dash and Ben Carson, they're Black, but like the Black community does not claim them. So it's like, it's very complicated, and it's a very it's a conversation and an argument that will really get you nowhere, because again, there's no one way to be Black. It's really just, do you align yourself with other Black people and the advancement for Black people, or do you not? Just depends. The second theme is microaggression. So the reaction to microaggression is the reason that we have this conspiracy. So professionally, how Black women respond to microaggressions, typically it's what gets them into trouble. Because a lot of people do not take microaggressions seriously, it's one of the most frustrating things in the world because technically no one's physically harming you. It may just be someone coming in and calling you Shaniqua every day. Like, it's not tangible, but it is harmful. So usually what gets Black women into trouble is their response to that. And they're not wrong, because we're talking about something that makes us uncomfortable. But these are the types of things that the OBGs don't have to deal with anymore because they found this majestic hair grease that numbs their feelings towards this so that it doesn't bother them anymore. An example of a microaggression is, so the fictional writer in this book called Colin Franklin, who has this piece, Needles and Pins, that showcases the only Black character as one-dimensional and problematic. And Nella had a real big problem with that because she's like, first of all, we don't really publish that many Black writers. Second of all, we have this author that just wants the only Black character in the book to just come off real coonish. So it's like she spoke up for herself and they didn't like that. And it made people uncomfortable that she was voicing her uncomfortableness. So that's an example of like dealing with microaggressions and how it can kind of backfire if you don't make sure everyone else is comfortable first. The last theme is alliance. So Black people have an unspoken alliance. It's necessary due to the low numbers, especially in these corporate offices. It's getting a little bit better now, but if you know that there's one other Black person, even if they're on the other side of the floor, like you already know, okay, I got that person's back, I'm not going to let them walk around crazy, or if I need to give them a heads up about something, I heard somebody else talking about them, that's just unspoken. And that's what Nella thought she had in Hazel. And I wanted to touch on gatekeeping under this. So gatekeeping is controlling or limiting access to something. So this was an interesting thing because although Nella and Hazel, from her perspective, had an alliance, they both were competing to be the one Black coworker that everyone liked and that everyone wanted to promote eventually. So not Hazel. Nella knew that Hazel was against her when she moved in between Nella's relationship with her boss. So she knew, she kind of picked up on the fact that something was off, because if we were in a true alliance, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't step on my toes to try to advance your career, especially because we're both Black women. So that's when she kind of started picking up on something's really wrong here. But I just thought that was interesting because although like we always talk about with Black women, how important it is to have another Black woman at work and how comfortable that can make us, once that one other person comes in, now it's like it feels like we're competing against each other to be the best, or to be the Blackest even, or to be up on what's happening with Jay-Z and Beyonce. Like, this sounds ridiculous, but like it feels that way. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic that Harris really wrote well, in my opinion. Okay, so review time. First of all, I love this book. And I didn't even know that other people didn't like this book until I started talking about it, and people would just be like, oh, like the editing was not good, or the writing didn't pull me in. I don't know what they're talking about. This book was absolutely fantastic to me. I just reread, because I read this a few months ago, but I reread a few more chapters this week just to kind of refresh my feelings on it. And the last chapter of this book was fire. Not the epilogue, but the last chapter, when Hazel finally gives us the true tea on what's been going on. I thought that was amazing, phenomenal. I thought the whole book was great. I do think, though, when it comes to unfavorable reviews about this, I think maybe one factor could be the timelines. So Like I said, there are two different timelines, and it's not like it's every other chapter. Like, the majority of this book is about the present day timeline. You may get flashbacks every 3 or 4 chapters or something like that. But it's harder because you don't know what's going on in either timeline, especially for like the first half of the book. So it's hard for you to place like certain events. But, you know, if you've been rocking with me on this podcast, I've read The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which is arguably the hardest flow to follow. It's very difficult to follow the events of that timeline. So this wasn't really anywhere near that. So, I mean, I enjoyed it. I was able to follow through it. The first time I read it straight through. The second time I was able to, there were certain chapters that I wanted to reread, so I just picked through. But I didn't have a problem reading through this book at all. And also, it's going to be adapted into, I think, a series by Hulu or maybe a movie. However, there are a couple of strikes going on. So I think it was supposed to come out in the fall. Or I don't know if I just pulled that out of thin air, but I know that when I first read this back in the fall of 2022, that they had casted it, and I think that they were filming it during that time period. So great. And honestly, this was the perfect time to reread this because They Clone Tyrone just dropped on Netflix. And I won't give spoilers away, but even just the idea that there's this black conspiracy, it pulls those two together, and there are some similar things that happen in They Clone Tyrone. So that was a phenomenal movie also. And then also Us, if you're looking for stuff to watch with or after, watch Us, watch They Clone Tyrone. Another book or 2 books that you could read after this is When No One Is Watching, and also The Sellout. And I think The Sellout is by Paul Beatty. I do know that When No One Is Watching is Alyssa Cole. So all of this, these conspiracy books and movies, I'm with it. I love it because it makes me so uncomfortable, which that's the writer doing their job. But it is kind of scary. And, you know, we're talking about topics that are not pleasant. And also as a Black woman, like dealing with this in real life, like it's not always super comfortable to read about it in my free time. But I thought that it was done very well. And I'm excited to see the series. So yeah, this will be a reread as soon as the Hulu adaptation comes out. I'll reread it beforehand. I'm super excited to see that last chapter play out between Nella and Hazel. However, let me just say before I get to my takeaways, now the reason I don't classify the OBGs as the enemies is because, in my opinion, the OBGs and the Resistance are 2 subgroups of Black women that are not fighting each other, but they're both coping with the racism in 2 different ways. So we've heard this before. It's kind of like the sword and the shield. So in my opinion, they're not fighting against each other. They just have 2 completely different ideals on how to handle that. However, there's a caveat to that because, of course, the ones that are being forced into the OBGs, you can't really count them as like, you know, they're doing this on their own free will, because they're not. But if there was a product available in real life that could numb the feelings or the reactions towards microaggressions or racism, or make it so that you just not even don't care anymore, but just like you don't feel so hurt by it, I'm going to be honest, I do think a lot of people would take it. Not every Black person would, but you have to understand that the impact of dealing with trauma unnecessarily every day, it takes a toll on you. And that's why, like, you got to give it up for some of these Black activists. I don't know how they do it because it's really tiring. It's emotionally draining to always have to fight. And there's an argument from the OBG side that you could do more for the Black community if you weren't so weighed down by this emotional trauma. So honestly, I didn't finish this book thinking that the OBGs were the explicit villains. I just kind of looked at it as they figured out a different way to handle things. So now, of course, this whole movement that they made is all being constructed and carefully rolled out by a white man. So that's problematic. But like the idea that you can offer somebody something like this hair grease, and it kind of brings them down a notch, and it makes it so they're not so, just simply put, stressed about this or hurt by these things, you can't blame them. So I'm not mad at it. I'm mad at the ones that they convert unwillingly, but I'm not mad at the overall idea. So takeaway, neither approach can be judged because it's arguably both for the good of Black people overall. You need those people that are not fazed so much by it to advance and get these higher positions so that maybe they can hire more Black people. You also need the ones that are going to fight. However, if something like this ever does happen, you need to be very careful, okay, about buying into this, because you need to look at who can take advantage of that conspiracy or of that other side. Because it may be good for you, it may be good for the cause, but who's benefiting from creating something like this, you know? So that was my only takeaway. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. I will see y'all next week. Thanks.